What if a single, worn metal could bring an entire courtroom to its feet, and force a judge to confront not just the law, but the weight of a man's honor? If you believe in stories that reveal the strength hidden in ordinary people, subscribe now. You don't want to miss what's coming next. The old courthouse of Brooksville was suffocating under the weight of late summer heat. Fans hummed faintly in the corners, barely disturbing the heavy air. Dust motes drifted lazily in the thick sunlight pouring through tall, thin windows. Every bench was filled, the overflow stood along the back wall, hats removed, faces tense. At the witness stand stood Edward Geddy Callahan, wearing a blazer once dark navy, now faded and worn at the elbows. It hung a little loose on his narrow shoulders. His white dress shirt was neatly pressed, but frayed at the cuffs. Pinned over his heart was a tarnished Distinguished Service Cross, the ribbon faded with age. The metal itself was dulled, but when the light caught it just right, it still burned with quiet defiance. Eddie's posture betrayed both dignity and weariness. He stood as if he were still in the service, spine straight, chin high, but with the tremble of too many years carried alone. On the raised bench sat Judge Raymond Hale, a man known in Brooksville as much for his meticulously combed silver hair as for his disdain for sentimentality in the courtroom. His black robe sat like armor around his proud shoulders. His eyes, small and sharp, watched Eddie as a hawk would a wounded sparrow. "Mr. Callahan," Hale said, his voice flat but sharp, slicing through the low murmur of the room. "This is a court of law. Not a veterans' parade. Remove that metal." For a beat, no one moved. A soft intake of breath spread through the gallery. Somewhere in the back, a young woman put her hand to her mouth. The bailiff shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Eddie's hand moved slowly. His fingers, curled by age and work, brushed the metal like it was something alive. He unclipped it with a care that made the moment feel ceremonial. No ceremony was intended. None was offered. He laid it on the wooden desk before him, next to the worn microphone, with the same deliberate reverence one might use to fold a flag after a funeral. The small metallic clink echoed faintly in the hushed space. Judge Hale didn't flinch. "Proceed," he ordered. The opposing counsel, a young attorney named Mr. Clarkson, straightened his tie and resumed. "Mr. Callahan, can you produce any written documentation proving that this piece of land was given to you?" Eddie lifted his eyes. Blue-gray steady. Tired but not broken. "No, sir. It was never written down. It was given to me by Michael Davenport, brother of my friend Matthew. Matthew never made it back from Vietnam. Michael said it was right that I should have it." Clarkson gave a thin smile. "So, verbal agreement. Convenient, isn't it?" Before Eddie could respond, Judge Hale cut across. "A hearsay. Not relevant." A new kind of weight filled the courtroom now. It wasn't just heat or dust or the smell of old wood and worn carpet. It was history. Memory. Grief packed tight beneath uniforms and pressed shirts, behind worn eyes and folded hands. Eddie said nothing more for a moment. His jaw worked slightly, as if he were chewing words before swallowing them whole. But something had shifted. The people in that room weren't watching a property dispute anymore. They were watching a reckoning between past and present. Between a man's quiet honor and another man's brittle authority. Even the bailiff, standing rigid at the door, found himself pressing his palm softly over his heart, as if feeling for something he thought he'd forgotten. The air was changing, but no one yet knew just how much. The stand. It began with the faintest scrape of polished leather soles against old wooden floors. A tall figure stood up at the very back of the gallery. His dress uniform was immaculate, sharp creases, shining buttons, white gloves tucked neatly beneath his belt. Across his chest glimmered the unmistakable Medal of Honor, so brilliant that even the dim courtroom light made it flash like a beacon in the dark. For a breathless second no one spoke. Even the ceiling fan above seemed to hesitate. Then the man's voice rang out, steady, resonant, not loud, but carrying with the weight of command. "Your Honor, permission to address the court." Hale's jaw tensed. He didn't like losing control, especially not to the unexpected. "Identify yourself," he barked, tone clipped. The man took 2 precise steps forward. A Colonel James Alcott, United States Marine Corps, retired. Serial number 3187690. recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions during the Battle of Hue. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a wave of recognition. Several older men in the audience exchanged glances, sitting straighter. "I'm here," Yalcott continued, "because that man, Edward Callahan, saved the lives of 32 soldiers. My unit. In 1968. No press. No photographs. Just blood and broken bodies. And him, dragging men out of burning buildings one by one, until he couldn't stand on his legs anymore." Clarkson tried to interject. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the matter at hand." But Alcott didn't even glance at him. His eyes were locked on the judge, sharp and unforgiving. "What is relevant, sir, is that this court just humiliated a man whose honor you are not qualified to question." Judge Hale shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath his robe. His lips parted, but for once no words came. Across the courtroom, one by one, men and women began to rise. Quiet. Respectful. Some wore caps from wars gone by: Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. Others were nothing but civilian clothes, their faces hard and lined with years of labor and sacrifice. The silence was thunderous. No chanting. No shouting. Just the slow, deliberate act of standing, not for spectacle, but in recognition. Eddie Callahan didn't turn to look. His eyes were fixed on the grain of the wood before him, as if reading the life written in each scratch and groove. Colonel Alcott stepped forward again. "If this court sees fit to question the word of a man who's given everything for this country, then perhaps it's not just the land at stake here, but the soul of this place." A soft creak of pews shifting filled the room, like an old ship adjusting to a sudden weight of truth. Outside, church bells from a block away began to toll the hour. Noon. The sound felt like punctuation. Like the closing of an old chapter, and the uneasy, undeniable start of something new. Judge Hale stared at Alcott, then at Eddie, then at the roomful of silent, rising witnesses. His gavel sat untouched beside his hand. For once in his career, he didn't seem so certain whose courtroom this really was. The reckoning. The next sound was not a gavel striking, but the sharp, dry scrape of Judge Hale pushing himself away from the bench. His fingers gripped the edges of the wooden armrests like a drowning man clinging to the last sliver of certainty. He stood slowly, stiffly, like a man fighting against the weight of years, not just age, but choices, regrets, mistakes stacking higher than the thick law books behind him. The courtroom air had changed completely. Gone was the sluggish heat of summer. In its place was something brittle, electric, as if the entire room was holding its breath, suspended in the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Judge Hale's voice, usually sharp and scornful, carried a new quality, fragile, like something cracked beneath fresh paint. "This court recognizes the honorable service of Mr. Callahan. But this remains a matter of property law, not sentiment or ceremony." The formality clung to him like an old uniform that didn't quite fit anymore. A murmur rippled through the gallery, not disrespectful, but disbelieving. This was no longer about land. Everyone knew it. Everyone except perhaps the man still standing behind the bench, clutching at codes and precedents like a man gripping prayer beads without faith. Then, unexpectedly, another voice rose from among the standing crowd. This one didn't bark, didn't command, it simply existed with weight, with history, with dignity. "Permission to speak." The tone was unmistakable. Calm. Judicial. It belonged to Judge Kenneth Monroe, retired but never forgotten. Monroe didn't wear a robe anymore. Just a charcoal gray suit that sat clean and modest across his broad shoulders. His hair was mostly gone, leaving a smooth scalp that caught the late sunlight. His dark eyes were steady, unflinching, eyes that had seen more justice, and more failures of it, than anyone else in that room. He stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes whispering against the worn planks of the floor. "Raymond," he said, "not Your Honor, not Judge Hale. Just Raymond. A stripping away of title. Man to man. I sat that bench for 40 years before you. I know discretion when I see it abused. I know fear when I hear it speak." The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, drawn like metal filings to a magnet. Monroe's gaze swept across the gallery. This land wasn't just a gift for war. It was a gift for decency. For sacrifice, yes, but not the kind that fits neatly in military records. I presided over 3 cases where Edward Callahan stepped in to stop harm coming to others. A home fire, a robbery, a flood that nearly wiped out half the West Side. No one asked him to. No medal pinned him then. The mention of those old stories, long forgotten by some, brought new life to the faces in the room. Whispers of recognition. Someone's father saved. Someone's brother helped. Little pieces of Eddie's life weaving back into the collective memory of the town. Judge Hale opened his mouth, perhaps to push back, but no words came. And then came another voice, softer still, like the memory of a promise made long ago. I did write it down. The whole room shifted toward the speaker as one body. Michael Davenport, older, stooped slightly from years of hard farming, lifted a folded, yellowed sheet of paper in one trembling hand. His face was pale, his mouth pressed thin, but his eyes, clouded by cataracts, held a piercing clarity. I didn't think it mattered, Michael continued, voice steadying now that it was finally free. Didn't think anyone would question a handshake between men who'd shared grief. But I wrote it. Been in my drawer for 30 years. With careful reverence, the letter was passed, hand by hand, from standing veteran to standing neighbor, like a sacred object being carried through a congregation. It finally reached the bailiff, who glanced once at the judge, then crossed the courtroom with steps as heavy as verdicts. When he laid the folded letter before Judge Hale, the paper barely made a sound, but its arrival struck harder than any gavel. Judge Monroe didn't need invitation. Read it. Hale stared at the letter as if it might catch fire. Finally, with stiff fingers, he unfolded it. The writing was crooked, shaky, the ink faded at the corners, but it was legible. I, Michael Davenport, hereby gift the North Pasture to Edward Callahan, in thanks for services rendered to my family and to this country. Signed, Michael Davenport. Dated, September 14, 1974. The date was unmistakable. The ink old but real. Legal. Binding. The tide broke. Not with noise, but with silence. Respect shifted in that room, visibly, like chairs pushed back from a meal no one would finish. Hale could feel it moving, leaving him behind, his authority dissolving grain by grain, like a sandcastle beneath the rising tide. He looked up, not at Monroe, not at Davenport, not at Alcott's shining Medal of Honor, but at Edward Callahan, who sat silent, weathered, dignified. Eddie's fingers lightly traced the edge of his old Distinguished Service Cross on the table, now catching light like a secret finally told. Hale began, voice rasping. He tried again. I recuse myself. It wasn't an apology. But it was surrender. He sat back down with a thud, the weight of years slamming into the leather of his chair. Monroe didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, picking up the letter with both hands like a priest holding scripture. Then let's do this right. The entire room exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. The right thing, not the easiest, not the procedural, but the one everyone knew had been true all along. Colonel Alcott finally allowed himself a small nod. Davenport's shoulders sagged, the decades-long burden visibly sliding off like a heavy coat finally shrugged loose. And one by one, those standing began to sit, not in defeat, but in solidarity. Eddie's lips parted into the smallest of smiles. A man who had carried other men's bodies through gunfire could finally set down something heavier, doubt. No applause. No cheers. Just truth settled like dust finally allowed to fall in still air. Outside, unnoticed by most, the first cool breeze of late summer stirred the flag above the courthouse, making it ripple gently against a pale sky. For the first time in a very long time, Brooksville felt clean. In a world where power often hides behind procedure, the weight of silence reminds us that dignity, sacrifice, and quiet courage speak louder than titles or authority. Sometimes, it's not the loudest voice that wins, but the one carrying the heaviest truth. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, share it, subscribe, and join us for more untold stories of quiet heroes. Your voice here matters.